It's good to see you again tonight. I'd ask you to take your Bibles out, put your bookmark in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, if you would. And after you mark that, you can flip all the way back over to the beginning of Ecclesiastes, and that's where we're going to start our study. I would ask for a moment of your time before we actually begin our study to offer a few personal comments. First of all, to the church here, particularly to the overseers, I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. I understand the gravity of the work that you do and the challenge thereof and the efforts and the thought, the prayer that goes into trying to arrange opportunities for the local folks to study together, to be exposed to different preachers, to engage in activities besides the regular worship. And I'm very honored to have been asked to come and to try to participate in that. I hope that the things that we've talked about through the week have been kind of what you had in mind. Most of the folks in the congregation probably are not aware of the process that goes into a gospel meeting between the preacher and the elders. We've actually been talking about different subjects and things for a number of months now. And so we kind of settled on this, and I hope that our efforts have been profitable in your estimation to the congregation here, and I appreciate your confidence in asking me to be a part of that. I echo what John has said. I have known John from afar. Our paths have crossed a time or two, but I'm a bit of a loner. Now, actually, I'm a whole bunch of a loner. And so I'm not one of these guys that runs around socializing with other preachers on a regular basis. Although I have great respect for my preaching brethren and the work that they do, and I really appreciate all the different personalities that you find among guys that preach the gospel. And I have thoroughly enjoyed being with you this week, and I appreciate the work that you do. Bid you Godspeed in that, and I look forward to the time we'll get to visit together some more. So thank you. Thank all of you for your hospitality, for your kindness, for the kind comments, for the way that you listen. If we can ever get the yes and the no down, we will have made some progress. But other than that, most of you stay awake through the whole sermon, and that's a big change for me. So I'm excited about that, and I appreciate that. Appreciate your hospitality and you having me in your homes. And I'm especially grateful for the kind way that you've treated my family. As we were walking out last night, Tori walked up and said, "Boy, these folks are just so nice." And when you make an impact upon teenagers, that says a lot about you as a congregation. So thank you for the kind way that you have treated them, and I'm thrilled that they've been able to be here with me this week. I bid you Godspeed in your work. I recognize that trying to stand up and do right in our day and age is a challenge, and it can become discouraging. You drive down May, and there's church building after church building, and they are huge. And I must say, I think sometimes our brethren, we kind of get this woe is us attitude, because we'll look around and we'll have a gospel meeting. You might have 100 folks. You might not have that many show up. And you go down the road and hear these huge buildings. But I must tell you, last night, one of them was showing a movie on the grounds. And the chances are pretty good if you started doing that kind of stuff, you get a lot of more folks here. But you wouldn't necessarily get more folks to heaven. And so I appreciate what you're doing. I want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. The Lord said, there are many called and few are chosen. And I don't think that means we're supposed to be satisfied with small numbers. But I do think that we need to be realistic about the fact that most people are not going to embrace the purity of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because the reality is it is a demanding life that God asks us to lead. And but the rewards are so far beyond the sacrifices that are asked of us. And so I encourage you to keep on keeping on, and I will think about you and wonder how you are doing, and bid you Godspeed, and hopefully we can be together in the future, if not on this side of eternity, certainly on the other. So thank you so much for everything through the week. There are a lot of approaches that people in our day and age take to trying to teach the gospel. And in some ways, if the essence of the gospel was nothing more than you need to be baptized to have your sins forgiven, and that's all there was to it, the chances are we could baptize lots and lots of people. The reality is, as I just mentioned, the demands of the gospel are far more than simply accepting the reality that Jesus lived and that He was God and that He died and that we need to put our trust in Him. The demands of that trust are taxing and they are challenging and they are difficult, and it is a disciplined life that God asks of us. If it was easy, the numbers would change. And because there are challenges associated with trying to spread the gospel and get people to see the reality of the gospel and not only what it offers but what it demands, because that's a challenge, we're always looking for different ideas and different ways to go about teaching people. And I find that kind of curious to see what different people do. And John and I talked at lunch yesterday at some length about some of the things that this congregation's involved in, some of the things that he does on a personal level, and I find that interesting. But let me suggest to you that a lot of times when you're going to try to engage someone in teaching the gospel, where you start can make a big difference. And it doesn't make all the difference, but it can make a big difference. And I want to make a suggestion to you if you haven't tried this. I want to suggest to you that you spend some time in the book of Ecclesiastes. If there's a book in the Bible that is dedicated to our day and our culture, it is the book of Ecclesiastes. And we've mentioned it several times through the week. Of course, we've been focusing on Old Testament literature and lessons that find their grounding in the Old Testament. And I think, honestly, that if you're going to study the Old Testament, at some point you're going to come back to Ecclesiastes in almost every study you do because of the wisdom that is there. And I want you to appreciate how it fits with the culture in which we live. We are materialistic. We are a pleasure-driven world. We are people consumed with materialism, like we talked about last night. We are people who are very selfish. We are people who are looking for something new. We are technologically oriented. We are given over to just constantly bombarding our senses. That's where we are as a culture. And at the same time, there is a philosophical bent to our culture. We're a religious culture. We're a culture that likes to think of ourselves as pretty smart and that thinks through things and that's rational and has different philosophical perspectives. Look at the political landscape in our day, and you see people of a wide array of philosophies about how life is supposed to happen, about how government is supposed to happen. We're a people who think. Now, not as much as we should, mainly because of television, but we are people who like to think. We're an educated people. Do you appreciate all the things that I just described are things that Solomon deals with in the book of Ecclesiastes? If you're not familiar with the book, the way the book is laid out is that Solomon begins in chapter 1 and in verse 3 by saying, "What profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun?" And that is the essential question. It's kind of an interesting book because he offers his conclusion before he even offers his introductory question. The verse right before that is, "Vanity of vanity," says the preacher, "everything's vanity." And then he says, "Here's my big experiment. I'm going to spend my life, or I'm going to spend at least a part of my life, and I'm going to take the wisdom that God has given me, and I'm going to try to figure out what's profitable. Where do I give my time and my attention? I've got a few years to live on this earth. What do I do with myself?" And I do believe that Solomon at the outset tries to limit that to life what he calls under the sun, meaning the material world, the temporal world. I'm not going to think about the spiritual realm. If I'm just going to look at this world as a material, limited existence, what do I do with myself? And he can't help, because he's a wise man, by saying at the very outset, "Well, let me tell you what I found before I tell you where I'm going. I found life's pretty empty. And this is what I set out to do." And so as he goes through the book, he talks about joy, and he talks about pleasure, and he talks about prosperity, and he talks about life, and he talks about death, and he talks about wisdom, and he talks about folly. He talks about time and chance. He talks about justice and injustice. He talks about work and leisure. He talks about getting old. He talks about frustration in life. He talks about all the various and sundry things you can do in life. And it's a hard book. It's hard because there are times that it's very disjointed. And it's hard to see if there's a context. And there are times when Solomon's wisdom, because it is divinely given, I really think just sometimes get a little beyond us as to exactly what does he mean when he says he put eternity in our hearts so that we can find nothing after us. I don't have all those answers. But what I know is that Solomon starts off with this experiment. The irony of the experiment, and by the way, that's what everybody in our culture is doing. Your next door neighbors, they're living Ecclesiastes. They're trying to figure out what's important in life. Do I give myself to more education? Is it a better job? Is it my retirement I focus on? Is it my health and my physical well-being? Do y'all have somebody in your neighborhood that's a workout freak and they're just constantly running? Makes you sick. They're all muscled up. They're 65 years old. They look like Charles Atlas. Sorry, you younger people have no idea who that is. They look like the Rock, okay? And you look at him and you just go, that guy right there, he just makes me sick. Makes me sick. Well, you know what he's doing? He's giving his life to the pursuit of the development of his physical body, and that's the end-all be-all of life to him. Our world is living Ecclesiastes. The irony of this is that Solomon doesn't get very far into the book before he offers the big conclusion. Now you and I know, if you're a Christian, if you've studied Ecclesiastes at all, that the conclusion of the whole matter, I asked you to put your bookmark in chapter 12. And when he gets to the end of the book, he finishes it this way. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it's good or evil. Now that's his conclusion. What I want you to notice is he offers his conclusion a long time before he ever gets to his conclusion. He starts off saying, let's talk about life under the sun. But when you get to chapter 3, okay, now it's 12 chapters. We're not a quarter of the way into the book. And in chapter 3 and in verse 14, he says, I know that whatever God does, it will be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing take it from it. God does it that men should fear before Him. Well, wait a minute, Solomon. God's not an under the sun element. God's an outside the sun element. And yet you're already talking about fearing Him. What happens to this experiment? Well, the way I think Ecclesiastes is to be understood is that Solomon just can't get away from who we really are. We are spiritual people. I don't care what culture you're involved in, and I don't care what your objectives in life are. We are spiritual people, and as hard as he tries to limit everything to under the sun, he just can't help it. He starts talking about fearing God. He does it again in chapter 5 and verse 7. In the multitude of dreams and many words there's vanity, but fear God. He does it again in chapter 8 and verses 12 and 13. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I know surely that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before Him. So by the time he gets to chapter 12, it should come as no surprise that while life under the sun truly is empty and frustrating and vain, fortunately for us, there's more to life than life under the sun. And so his conclusion is, fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole of man. I'm reading from the New King James. This is the whole of man. The old King James read, this is the whole duty of man. Actually, the New King James says this is man's all. Some of the New King James actually says this is the whole of man. And if you're reading American Standard Version or the English Standard or a different version of the NIV, it says something like this is man's all or this is all of man. And we have a hard time coming up with exactly how to translate that little phrase there. But the meaning of it is, if you're going to try to describe the very essence of what it is to be a human being, this is the way Solomon sums it up. Fear God and keep His commandments. Now let me ask you a question, having gone through all of that. If Solomon's conclusion, and he's the wisest man who's ever lived, because God gave him the wisdom. If Solomon's conclusion is that the very essence of life is fearing God and keeping His commandments, why don't we talk about that more? When's the last time that as you discussed spiritual things with someone, you gave any time to talk about fearing God? And the chances are pretty good that we mention the concept of obedience, but we're kind of reluctant because that's a hang-up for a lot of people. But Solomon says, God says through Solomon, this is the very essence of who we are. So I want to talk with you about that for a few moments. I want you to understand something at the very outset about this. Solomon reached this conclusion for two reasons, in my opinion. Number one, because he's an exceptionally wise man. But number two, because he's the king of Israel. And if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, what you'll find is that in the book of Deuteronomy, the command to fear God and keep His commandments in some fashion is mentioned 15 times in the book of Deuteronomy. Are you aware of the fact that the king of Israel, according to God, was responsible for taking the book of Deuteronomy and writing it out by hand himself and keeping a personal copy with him? Were you aware of that? So I want to propose to you that while Solomon's a young man, or when Solomon first is understanding he's going to become king, at some point, if he was faithful to God, and I think he probably was, he would have written this out. And as he's writing through those 30 chapters or so of Deuteronomy, he keeps running into this idea that Israel, you're supposed to fear God and love God and keep His commandments. So this is not a new thought with him. God had been planting this in his head from the beginning. So as he's going through his grand experiment, in the back of his head, what he knows all along is, my job is to fear God and keep His commandments. So let me talk with you about that for just a few minutes that we have left. I want to at the very first make this observation because I think this is important. And it's not necessarily the most important part of the lesson, but I think is exceptionally significant, and it's something that we have a hard time with. I want to propose to you that the idea of fear God means fear God. Most of my life, I've heard preachers talk about the concept of fearing God. It's a concept that you run into a lot in the Scriptures. And very often we, in my opinion, underrate or underemphasize the real significance of the concept because we define the term in a secondary way. We tend to be uncomfortable with the idea of fear in the sense of being scared of God. And so, most of the time, you'll hear people, you'll hear preachers, you'll hear teachers, we'll do it ourselves, that will say, well, fear God means you need to have a healthy respect for God. You need to reverence God. I do believe that meaning is in the term, but if you go look up the words, the Hebrew word for fear is Yahweh, not Yahweh, which is the name of God. It is Y-A-R-E, as you transliterate it into English. And the meaning of the term is to frighten. That's what the word means. You see the adjective form of it a lot in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. It's translated dreadful or awesome. How awesome is this place? What they're describing is, I'm afraid. How terrible, how fearful. The word doesn't initially mean reverence. Now, reverence grows out of it. Whatever makes us afraid, we tend to kind of give due respect to. And that's where the connection is. The New Testament uses a very similar term. It's a Greek term, but it's used in the same way that fear of God is used in the Old Testament. The Greek term is phobio or phobeo, and it's a term that we have used in our English language. In fact, we've transliterated. You know what a phobia is? A phobia is a fear. In fact, very often we think of it as an irrational fear of something. And we're familiar with arachnophobia is the fear of spiders. Agoraphobia is the fear of big, wide open spaces. Acrophobia is the fear of heights. Claustrophobia is the fear of little bitty tiny spaces. I read one the other day that I thought was interesting. Arachobutyrophobia. Now get this. This is a real word. And it means the irrational fear of having peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth. I don't know who came up with that, and I don't know who's really afraid of that. But what it describes to us, and what I want you to get is the root word, because it is the word we're talking about. What it describes to us is something we're afraid of. Tori is scared to death of caterpillars. And always has been. I don't know what caterpillarophobia, I don't know the real word, but she has it. If she sees one on TV, she hyperventilates. You know, she doesn't look at that and go, there's a caterpillar. I have a healthy reverence and regard for that caterpillar. No. There's a caterpillar and there goes Tori. Because she's scared of them. Now I want you to get that concept. That's not hard, is it? But suddenly when we start in the Bible reading fear God, we want to soften that concept. And I must tell you folks, in my opinion, we invalidate the concept when we do that. We are very uncomfortable in our day and age. People object to this on a regular basis. You shouldn't be afraid of God because God is love. I've heard people say that. And I must tell you, if you only think God in the sense of God is love, then you have a perverted view of God. And I say that without any hesitation whatsoever. You can think me hard, you can think me unkind, you can think what you want, but let's kind of see how the Bible portrays that. Keep your bookmark in Ecclesiastes. And I'm not going to read these passages, but I'm going to reference them. And if you want to skim through them as I go, that's fine. What I want you to notice is as you go through the Bible, how people react when they encounter God. Now, I do not believe that God in His real appearance, whatever that is, I don't believe that He appeared to man except for perhaps to Moses. Because we know for a fact, God tells Moses, no one can look at my face and live. I don't know how God appeared to Abraham, how God appeared to Adam and Eve in the garden. That's a curiosity to me because they walked and were in His presence prior to their sin. So they saw something. They heard His voice and they described Him as walking in the garden. But what I do want you to notice is after sin, man always reacts to the appearance of God in the same way. Genesis chapter 3, after the sin of Adam and Eve, God's walking in the garden. He calls out to them, says, where are you? And Adam says, I hid myself because, do you remember? I was afraid. And that statement, that's a really telling statement. The rest of the Bible, God's calling man, going, where are you? And the rest of the Bible, man's hiding himself from God out of fear because of our sin. The rest of the Bible is fixing that. But I want you to see that that's where it starts. And from then on, God's dealing with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and in verse 1, or in chapter 17 and verse 3. When God appears to Abraham the first time in chapter 15, the first thing He says to him, I'm the God of your fathers, don't be afraid. Why would you say that? Well, the only reason He's going to say that is because Abraham's natural reaction to whatever appearance God is taking is Abraham's afraid. When you get to chapter 17 and God appears to him another time, Abraham falls on his face. When you go to chapter 26 and He deals with Isaac, Isaac does the same thing. He falls on his face before God. In chapter 28, when it is Jacob in the Jacob's ladder scene, Jacob's description of the place is how awful is this place. How fearful is this place? The very, he says, gateway to heaven. When God appears to Moses in the burning bush. Moses, when God speaks to him, falls down before God. Chapter 3 and verse 6. Isaiah, who sees the throne scene of God. How God appears to him, I do not know. You really can't see God's face, but there is this throne scene. Isaiah's reaction to that in Isaiah chapter 6 is, woe is me, I am undone because I have seen God. Same thing happens to Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 1 when he sees the chariot of God coming across the plains of Susa. Ezekiel falls on his face as a dead man and God has to tell him, get up, I need to talk to you. When God deals with man in a direct way in the Bible, man's afraid of Him. And we need to see that. And that picture is borne out. In fact, I would ask you to turn over to Deuteronomy with me. Actually, let's start in Exodus. Turn over to Exodus chapter 19, and I want you to notice that at least at one point it was God's intention to cause man to be afraid of Him. In Exodus 19, when Moses and the children of Israel get to Mount Sinai, you remember the story. They set boundaries around the mountain. For 3 days they purify themselves because God is going to speak with His people. And sure enough, at the end of Exodus chapter 19, all the people gather around the mountain. In verse 16, in the morning there was thundering and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of a trumpet that got louder and louder. Notice in verse 16, the camp trembled. People are scared to death. They're out in the middle of nowhere, folks, all camped around this mountain, and suddenly there's a storm on the mountain, which in and of itself might not be so unnatural, but then the trumpet starts blowing, and it gets louder and louder, and things start shaking. Verse 18, Mount Sinai is completely in smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire, and the smoke ascends to heaven like a furnace, and the whole mountain is shaking. And that's the scenario when God begins to speak to them. That's when you get to chapter 20, and I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You had no other gods before me. And He says to them the 10 Commandments. At the end of that, in verse 18, when God finishes speaking, all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking, and the people saw it. They trembled and stood afar off and said to Moses, "You speak with us and we will hear, but let not God speak with us lest we die." Moses' response is one of the most ironic statements in all of the Bible. I don't know if you've ever paid much attention to it, but Moses says to them in verse 20, "Do not be afraid, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that His fear may be before you." Have you ever noticed that before? Don't be afraid. God's done all this so you'd be afraid. That's what He tells them. And I know that's what He tells them, and I know that's what He means. Because if you go over to the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 40 years later, to the children of these people, Moses rehearses this event. He goes back and describes it again. And he talks about God descending on the mountain. And he talks about God speaking to His people. And he talks about the reaction of God's people to Him and the giving of the 10 Commandments. I want you to give attention to chapter 5. And by the time he gets to the description of it, I'll start reading in verse 26, okay? Or verse 25. The people are speaking to Moses. "Now therefore, why should we die? This great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, we will die. Who is there of all flesh who's heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived? You go near and hear all that the Lord our God may say, and tell us all that the Lord our God says to you, and we will hear and do it. Then the Lord heard the voice of your words." This is Moses describing God's reaction. "The Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I've heard the voice of the words of this people that they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep my commandments." Do you know why God did that the way He did it? Because He wanted those people to be impressed with the power and the majesty of God, and He wanted them to be afraid of Him. And there's a reason He wanted to be afraid of them. And it's very much reflected in this section of Deuteronomy. They're about to go in and take the land of Canaan. In the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses keeps telling them, you're going to go in the land, there's giants in the land, but don't be afraid of them. You're going to go in the land, there's walled cities in the land, but don't be afraid of them. You're going to go into the land and there's armies in the land, standing armies, trained armies, but don't be afraid of them. He says that over and over in the first 3 chapters. And then you get to chapters 4, 5, and 6, and over He says, fear God. I want you to fear God. You need to fear God. You know what God's doing with them? Here's men, and here's me. Now, who should you really be afraid of? The book of Deuteronomy begins and ends with God encouraging them to choose sides. Chapter 11 and again in chapter 30. Choose you this day whom you will serve, like Joshua did, the next generation later. And what God has done up to this point in time is impress them with His power. Those people can't do anything to you if I'm on your side. But if you give yourself to them, you better be afraid of what I can do to you. That is a principle, folks, that establishes a spiritual reality that was intended not only for those people, but for every generation, including ours, and that is that we need to have a healthy fear of God. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus says the same thing to His apostles. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 4, He says, I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and after that have no more that they can do. I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who after he has killed has the power to cast into hell. Yes, fear him. I'm convinced that part of the issue in our day, and the reason that people aren't as religious as they should be, and the reason that our world is becoming more and more immoral, is because people just aren't afraid of God anymore. People don't want to think about hell. They don't want to think about punishment. They don't want to see God as a God who would ever do anything like that. And they dismiss God. They don't read their Bibles. They don't understand the God that we serve. We are becoming what Paul described in Romans chapter 3 when he goes through this long list of quotes describing the ungodliness of man, and he finishes it by saying there is no fear of God before their eyes. You know, if we gave a little more thought to what God can do, we might give a little more thought to what we ought to do. I mean, look at the Old Testament picture. Sodom and Gomorrah. God rained fire and brimstone and destroyed people because He couldn't even find 10 righteous men in those cities. People died. Go back earlier than that. Go to Genesis chapter 6. Go to the flood account. And think in real world times and real world thoughts what happened on that occasion. When the rain started and the flood started coming up and God closed the door of the ark and Noah and his family and all the animals are in there and the water gets higher and higher. You know what that sounded like? It sounded like people doing this on the side of that ark. Hey, let us in. The water out here is getting higher. The trees are covered up. We're running out of hills to get up to. My children are going to die. And they did die. And God killed them. Is that uncomfortable to your ears? Exodus chapter 3 through 10, He brought plagues upon Egypt and destroyed the firstborn of every family in Egypt and every family in Israel that did not put the blood of the Passover on their door. In the book of Numbers, because the children of Israel were faithless and continued to rebel, He destroyed and allowed to die an entire generation of people. As you go through the Old Testament, He brought the Assyrians upon the nation of Israel. The Assyrians were brutal, folks. They took the flayed skins of the kings that they defeated, and they put them on the pillars in their palaces. They were brutal people, and they brutalized God's people. And He did the same thing with the Babylonians to the people of Judah, and He did the same thing with the Greeks in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, and He did the same thing with the Romans in AD 70, where 1.1 million people died in the destruction of Jerusalem. We need to understand this aspect about the God that we serve. When He punishes sin, and that's what all of those were, it's scary. And He does punish sin. You ever noticed as Jesus is hanging on the cross and the thief next to Him is berating Him, the other thief's words, the one that Jesus saves, he looks to the other man and says, "Do you not even fear God, knowing that you're in the same condemnation?" They were dying on a tree as Jewish men under the old law. They stood no hope of eternal salvation, and He understood that. And He said, "Aren't you afraid of God?" I'm going to tell you, folks, We need to be afraid of what God can do and what God will do. Now, fortunately, it's not the end of the study, but it is the big point of the study. If you go back to Ecclesiastes, Solomon's conclusion is not only fear God. It is fear God and keep His commandments. He ties this concept of having a healthy respect for the judgment of God, and he goes on to say He's going to bring every work into judgment. He ties together that command with the idea of obedience. And that's the second point that I would make to you, and that is that fear ought to prompt us to be obedient people. In the book of Romans in chapter 13, Paul talks about civil government. Are you familiar with that passage? This is yes. Goodness gracious sakes alive. This is yes and this is no. Are you familiar with Romans chapter 13? Do I need to go over and read the whole chapter for us? Okay. Paul talks about the responsibility of a Christian civil government. And what he tells us, and you understand this, is that we are to be people who are obedient to the government. And the reason that Paul gives that we are to be obedient to the government, besides the fact that it is right in the eyes of God, is because if we are obedient to the government, we have no reason to fear punishment. We don't have to be afraid of the sword. We don't have to be afraid of the law. And it's interesting because this idea of fear of law prompts obedience, and it still does that in us. How many of you pay somewhat close attention to the speed limit? Nobody going to raise your hand, are you? Okay, the speed limit is what? 45 right here on May. 40. Speed limit is 40 on May. Do you drive 80 down that road? No. If there was a police officer sitting right down there, would you drive 50 on that road? No. Now, you might drive 50 if you knew there was no police officer. Would you do that? Probably. The reality is that we are very conscious of being punished by law for disobedience. We get that. It's a part of our life. It's a part of parenthood. In fact, Solomon, the same Solomon, as he goes through the Proverbs, makes the observation over and over about corporal punishment in regards to raising our children. I started to say capital punishment, which has crossed my mind. But the idea of the old, this is not actually in the proverb, but the concept is there, spare the rod, spoil the child. And Solomon, 3 or 4 different times, is very clear about if you want to raise children who are respectful, they need to be punished for their wrongdoing. And we get that. We understand that. That's why Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 1 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Because when we learn who God is, and we learn what right and wrong is, and we learn what God can do to punish us, then we start to act wisely as we weigh our options and learn that if I want to avoid discomfort and punishment in my life, I learn to be afraid of God. Now we get that, but I'm going to tell you, for those of us as Christians and those of us trying to make an impact on the world around us, this is something that we need to stand up for because obedience is falling out of popularity. And it's even, I would propose, falling out of popularity among our brethren. You know, singing is intended to teach and admonish. I know the music is great and we can have all these songs that have 27 different parts going 300 different directions and a bunch of different words, and nobody understands what anybody else is saying, which I think is probably vain worship because you're not teaching and admonishing one another. But the reality is, look at where our songs are going. The old songs, and I sound like an old man and a dinosaur, but I believe this, the old songs, we talked about trust and obey, marching to Zion. Now it's all about mercy and falling on our knees because we're so pitiful and we're so weak and how much we've got to have God's grace. And I must tell you, in a world that is bought in, hook, line, and sinker to Calvinism, it's a whole lot easier to fall down and ask God to forgive us than it is to get up every day and go obey Him. Asking for forgiveness is a lot easier. And it is reflected in the way that we think. I want you to understand something. I know you get it, but I want to underscore it. God demands compliance. God expects us to get up every day and go do what He's told us to do. Because we love Him and because we respect Him. But also because we fear Him. And the reality is, as we come to a healthy fear of God, then we're going to obey God. Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? If you love me, keep my commandments. It is a part of the life that we are intended to lead. But here's what I find fascinating about that. It is that obedience to God and that appreciation to God that introduces us to the love of God. In the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 10, when Moses offers the fear God and keep His commandments statement, he also says that we are to fear God and love Him and keep His commandments. And I find that a kind of a curious connection because we don't attach fear and love together very often, do we? But I think there is an attachment. The reality is we almost consider them to be diametrically opposed to one another, and you can't have one and have the other at the same time. But I want you to consider something. What is it that our obedience does for us? Is God just some megalomaniac up there that wants us to obey Him just because it makes Him feel important? Or has God asked us to give ourselves to His will because ultimately it's to our best good? You read Deuteronomy chapter 6, which we've referenced several times through the week, at the end of the chapter, and that's the chapter that says, talk to your children when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, keep them as blinders before your eyes. At the end of the chapter, Moses says, your children are going to come to you in the future and they're going to say, why do we keep these laws? And your answer is, because God saved us with a mighty hand, and it is our righteousness and it's our good always. I'm going to tell you something. If you are every day living a life of obedience to God, you're going to miss out on a whole lot of junk. Ever notice that? You're not going to lie and cheat and steal, so you're not going to have problems with that. You're not going to be out engaged in all kinds of sexual immorality, so you're not going to have any problems with the consequences that come from that. You're going to be nice to other people, and your relationships will be better. And the reality is we're the ones who benefit. And as we come to benefit, we come to appreciate God. We come to appreciate that obedience to Him brings us into a relationship where we enjoy His blessings. Here's the way I like to illustrate that. When my kids were little, especially my oldest daughter. My oldest daughter was a handful. Very strong-willed. And when she was little and she disobeyed, and buddy, she could stand there, look at you, and defy you like the best of them. I'd take her and I'd whip her. I'd pick her up because I was bigger and stronger than she was, and she would pitch a screaming fit, and I'd carry to her bed, and I'd lay her down, and I'd pop her 2 or 3 times so that she knew that she had done wrong and that hurt to do wrong. And that's the way things were for a while. But you know what she finally learned? She finally learned that when I asked her to do something and she did it, that the same strength that could pick her up forcibly, carry to her room, impose His will upon her, would then pick her up, take her out, put her in the pickup truck, go up to Dairy Queen, get an ice cream cone. You know, it's the same being. But what she found was I wasn't so bad, and I could really be okay, and there could be great benefits to be derived from obedience, and she was the beneficiary. Was she scared of me? Yeah. At least I like to think she was. Did she love me? Yeah, because all I cared about was her. She didn't understand that. Do we not see that that's the way God is? Do we not see that compliance and obedience because of fear is the first step to coming to an appreciation of God as we come to realize what He could do to us because of His power, but what He has done for us because of His love? Fear leads to obedience, which leads to love and appreciation, which leads to my final observation, and that is the thing I think that draws us the most to God. One of the 2 things that draw us the most to God is the fear of God. It's not just the love of God that draws us. I think it's also the fear of God that draws us. The things that scare us also attract us. Have you noticed that? I hate to say this because I know how you react to this. I've been a little disappointed this week that my kids hadn't got to see a good old South Plains thunderstorm. Because I remember growing up in West Texas, you could look off in the southwest, you could see it coming. And you'd watch it all day. And if it was a big, bad one, you could see that gray-green line at the bottom as the dust started getting picked up. And you knew there were hail in those clouds, and you could see the turbulence, and you thought, whoo, this one's going to be bad. And when it rolls in, the lightning and the wind and the tornadic activity is just absolutely terrifying. But how many people like to watch it? You know, we have a thunderstorm at home, and I'm out in the garage in a lawn chair watching it. Because the things that scare me, they also attract me, and I think it's that way with everyone. We go see the Grand Canyon. We want to get right up to the edge and hang our feet over that 9,000-foot drop down there because we're scared. Well, wait a minute. If we're scared, why aren't we way over there? Because that's not the way we're wired. You go to the zoo. How many of you go to the zoo and spend all your time looking at the fish? You want to go see the lions, and you want to hear them roar, and you kind of hope one of the animals falls into the lion's cage so you can watch it. Because the things that scare us are the things that attract us. And I don't know why it is that way, but it is that way. And it's that way across the board, whether it's the ocean, whether it is the environment around us, whether it's the animals around us, the things that appeal to our emotion appeal in a lot of different ways. In Exodus chapter 33, when Moses had been leading the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage to Mount Sinai, he goes up and he gets the law, and the people build the golden calf, and he goes down, and God basically tells him, look, I'm going to kill them all, and I'm going to start over with you. I've got plenty of time. And Moses begs God not to do that. In fact, there's an interesting discussion. Moses keeps saying, these are your people, and God keeps saying, no, these are the people you brought up. It's really fascinating to me. And finally, God says, okay, I'll go with you. You remember what Moses does at that point? I think at that point Moses felt closer to God than he ever did. He had actually, in his own mind, and I think, well, I won't say that. They'd had a discussion, and Moses had had great influence on God's decision. He had watched God part oceans. He had watched Him descend on Mount Sinai, the bread, just all this stuff that God was doing. At that point, that's when Moses says, would you show me your glory? I want to see you. I've been watching what you can do. I'm scared to death of you. I've fallen on my face in your presence at the burning bush. But I want to see you. And that's the way we are, folks. The thought of God scares me. But there's nothing that I'd like to see more. But because the God that we all need is a God that's capable of mass destruction. We need a God that can create with a word and destroy with a word. We need a God who is awesome and limitless in His power and omniscient in His wisdom and in His vision and without limitations on the things that He can do. A being that scares us. But because I'm going to tell you what we need from that being. We need a being that can conquer death, and we need a being that can fix sin, and we need a being that can make sure that Satan cannot tempt me so as I am unable to deal with the temptation, and we need a being that can forever intercede for us. The God that scares me is the very God that I need. And the same power that could destroy me eternally died on a cross. Makes intercession for me every day. His eyes are on the righteous. And His ears are open to my prayers. He forgives me. He does things I can't do for myself. And I'm scared of Him. But I love Him. And that's the whole man. The book of Revelation in chapter 4, there's a throne scene, one of 4 in the Bible. Exodus chapter 20, the elders along with Moses in some way on Mount Sinai share some kind of a meal with God, and they have a vision of the throne of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah gets to see the throne of God. In Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel sees a vision of the chariot of God, the visible, the moving throne of God. And then in Revelation chapter 4, John gets to see this vision of the throne of God. And those visions are always very similar. There's this great crystal sea that separates. You're a long ways away from God. And there's always bright lights, and there are living creatures surrounding the throne. And there's always a kind of I like to think of it as a smoke, a haze, a fog. Because the description is always, you can see that there's a being on the throne, but you never can make out the face. One of the promises at the very end of the Scriptures in Revelation, and I do believe that at this point he's talking about heaven, is that we're going to get to see the face of God. And I've thought about that a little bit, and let me offer this proposition to you as we conclude. I think there's a sense in which you and I get to determine the face of God. The face that we see when we get to look upon Him. If we are faithful to Him, we will see the picture of the Father in the story of the prodigal son, who's been watching down that road, waiting for his son to come back, and when he sees him coming over the hill, runs and embraces him, brings out the robe and the sandals and the ring, kills the fatted calf, and rejoices because the child has come home. That's the face I want to see. But if we disregard God, it's the face that looked upon the world because it had been so given to violence that He destroyed everyone with the flood. It's the face that was set as He leaves Abraham and goes off towards Sodom and Gomorrah to verify that He's going to go destroy these people. It's the face that looked at the children of Israel in their rebellion and sent the Assyrians and called for the Babylonians. It's the face of a God who gave the very best of heaven for us, only to watch us turn our back on Him, who will have every right to punish us, and has proven that He can do so and will do so, and we will deserve it. So which face are you going to see? We're going to have an invitation song. And we're going to have an opportunity to fix things with God tonight. If you need to do that, I want to encourage you to do it. I want to encourage you to start today determining the face you're going to see. Because, folks, the essence of our existence is to fear God and to keep His commandments. Because He's going to bring every work into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or whether evil. That's the God that died for us. That's the God I want. If that's the God you want, make your life right tonight. While together we stand, while we sing.